Hello everyone. I'm going to very quickly tell you a little bit about myself. Firstly, just some personal details, but I'm mostly going to talk about a couple of work areas that I'm quite passionate about. I came to New Zealand at the age of 11 in the 1960s, an immigrant family from Northern Ireland. We were an assisted passage family, as was quite common of the British immigrants in those days. My father was an engineer, and many of the flood control and road projects that you even see today in the Waikato he was responsible for. And then my mother worked for the IOD once the youngest child went to school. So my schooling from the age of 11 was in Hamilton, and then I went to Dunedin and studied medicine, became a doctor, and then came to Wellington in my junior doctor years and met some very interesting psychiatrists. I don't know if John Hall's here today, but he's one of the psychiatrists who are probably responsible for me going into psychiatry at that time. And then, for some reason, I fell into leadership roles in mental health or in psychiatry, and became involved eventually at a national level in the early 1990s in what I call the mental health reform agenda. Now, you heard from John Bosher last week about psychiatric hospitals in the 19th century, and they still existed in the 20th century, as you know, and in the 1990s. So the first part of that reform was actually moving to a much more integrated model of care for people with mental illness and trying to integrate it into the whole of health and the whole of medicine. But I thought I'd tell you a little story about that. So in the 1993-94, my mother-in-law asked me to talk to a group of wives, women that she was very friendly with, wives of Probus members and Rotary members, and this is in Christchurch, and this is what I would call the Christchurch establishment. I don't think Richard Norman, my husband's here today, but the Norman family were very much tied to Christ College and still are. And she wanted, you don't refuse your mother-in-law, and she wanted really me to talk about my role as Director of Mental Health and really what my views were about trying to change and modernise the mental health system. And so I did that. We had quite a good discussion, and at the end of an hour, many of these women then talked about children and other relatives that that were part of their family who were suffering quite severe mental illness, and no one had heard those stories before. These were stories that they didn't talk to each other about, even though they met regularly and knew each other. And I don't think that would happen to that extent today. And the two things that have been most important in that, in changing attitudes, have been the involvement of people who have experienced mental illness themselves, consumers or patients, in the system, and also the big anti-stigma discrimination campaign, of which you all know John Kerwin was one of the famous people that led that. I've stayed at the Ministry for quite a wee while, either doing mental health or population health, but more recently have moved to be the Chief Executive of a fairly new Crown entity called the Health Quality and Safety Commission, which formed in just the very end of 2011. And this is a commission, unlike the Civil Aviation Authority, which isn't really involved in regulation or setting standards or rules, but much more trying to work with people to bring about a quality improvement culture in health. And you might be surprised about that, but health has been a bit tardy compared with other industries in terms of thinking about a continuous quality improvement cycle. So they've been slow to adopt things like lean methodologies or Six Sigma or things that create greater efficiency and productivity, but also things that actually improve safety and quality of care. So we get all the adverse events, serious adverse events that happen in hospitals reported to us and across all of the health system. Now we focus on things that you traditionally think about what might create inadvertent harm when you enter a hospital, such as an infection or a fall that causes a fracture, or an adverse event from surgery, being operated on the wrong side or something, like that. So we've got a number of programs on that, but we also look at variation across the country, of variation of practice. And I just wanted to tell another story before I finish around hand washing, which is part of the infection prevention and control program. And you'd think that it would be absolutely universal for every clinician to wash their hands all of the time when they see patients. But when I started in 2011, only 65% of clinicians washed their hands in a hospital setting. Now, being a psychiatrist, of course, psychiatrists never wash their hands, except perhaps in the Pontius Pilate sense. So I had to kind of get my head back into this. And so you'd be pleased to know that we've actually moved to 80%, but it's actually about culture change, getting clinicians, particularly doctors, thinking that this is absolutely vital. It's about systemising it in a checklist kind of way, just like you do for air safety and so on. So this is a kind of just a little snippet of some of our work. You'll all know that I'm married to Richard Norman, who, as you know, wonderful man that he is, been a great support to me and given me lots of wise advice over the years. We have a son who's 28, who's quite different to us. He's a DJ in the nightclub scene in Wellington, so as different as you could imagine. And we have a cat and a dog that entertain us constantly with their antics. So, thank you.